speaker is Susana Canseco, Rancho Ojo de Agua.
Great. Well, as Cypress said, and thank you all for being here. This is a great turnout. I am a rancher and attorney. I am mostly going to be wearing the attorney hat while giving this talk. It's going to be a bit of a water law 101. I'm going to cover three kind of big areas of state water law, geared toward water users or future water users among you who are new to the whole water law area. So it's going to be broken up into surface water and the prior appropriation system, groundwater law and the rule capture, and groundwater conservation districts. And so to start out and explain why I have to divide it up into surface water versus groundwater, that is because surface water and groundwater are subject to different legal rules in Texas. That doesn't always make hydrologic sense, and because we know surface water and groundwater are often interconnected, and therefore it doesn't always make good policy sense, but it's the system that we have. So surface water in Texas is owned by the state, and to use it in any significant quantity, you have to get a permit from the state, which the state does through an agency called the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And that's kind of a mouthful. It usually goes by the acronym TCEQ, which is what I'm going to call it from now on. So that's the agency that oversees surface water permitting and enforcement and allocation. And so the system we use to then allocate the surface water rights, and that would be from rivers, streams, lakes, is called prior appropriation. And it's a system that's common in other western states too, and it basically sets up a hierarchy based on chronology of when you get to the river. So when whoever got to the river first and got their permitted right first, that user is senior to everyone who comes after him. So in the chain of chronology then you've got people who have, everybody's just about got somebody who's senior to them, somebody who's junior. And senior ends up being better because of something that I'm going to try to illustrate with a case that is currently pending in Travis County District Court and has to do with ag users. In the Brazos River Basin, so this is all taking place there, Dow Chemical is down near the coast, I assume, don't know exactly where, but relatively far downstream and has a relatively senior water right. Well, in the horrible drought we've been having over the last few years, because Dow has this senior water right, they're able to put a priority call on the other users upstream, which means that the junior users upstream then have to suspend their water use so that enough water flows downstream to get to Dow. And so Dow's done that a couple times in the last few years, and most recently this past November. And it does that, then it's TCEQ that does the kind of enforcing of that. And so in November, TCEQ looked at the whole picture and said that water users upstream of Dow who had water permits that were 1942 or since then, so any that were younger than 1942 had to suspend their water use so that enough water would flow downstream to Dow. And what that ended up affecting almost 1,000 permits, 700-ish were ag permits of some kind. And so that's how the prior appropriation system ends up working out. That a senior user downstream can put a call on the river like that. What ended up bringing this to a courthouse was that some ranchers and the Texas Farm Bureau brought a lawsuit because what TCEQ had done was exempt certain uses of water from this suspension. So cities and power plants were able to continue getting their water, but all of the ag users, even if they were senior to those cities and power plants, were cut off. And TCEQ is interpreting state law to allow it to do that, but the ranchers filed this lawsuit saying that's not how the prior appropriation system is supposed to work, and that TCEQ is overstepping its bounds in interpreting state law that way. So that lawsuit is pending. Lawsuits can take a long time to work their way through the courts, but I wanted to give that example because it does impact ag users, and it shows how TCEQ is is choosing between uses and applying the prior appropriation system. So if this lawsuit really does wind its way through the courts, then we may have a while to wait and see what happens with it. What ended up happening actually after the lawsuit was filed was that Dow apparently had enough water and said, never mind, all the junior users can go back to using it. So everybody is, for this season, going to have their water, all the users. But the ranchers are persisting with their lawsuit because they want a court to look at how TCEQ is interpreting state law when it applies the prior appropriation system in this kind of situation. So, to my mind, there might be some other ways that that could work itself out, maybe at the agency or legislatively. And so it'll be something interesting to watch, and hopefully that's kind of given you an overview of how the surface right permitting system works. Moving on then to groundwater. Groundwater is a totally different animal. Whereas surface water is owned by the state, groundwater is owned by the landowner, and the landowner can search for and pump as much groundwater as he wants for whatever purpose he wants. That's called the rule of capture, and that's the default rule in Texas. There is some level of groundwater regulation in parts of the state through groundwater conservation districts, which I'll talk about in a second. So this default rule where there is no district is that rule of capture, which is basically there's almost no rule. And that might be great if somebody is far away from their neighbors and has a great groundwater source and uses it for whatever they want. And that's a pretty happy sounding situation. And it's probably true for some people. The dangers of the rule of capture become apparent when you've got neighbors closer to each other and one has a bigger pump than the other. And example of this recently in the last few years came up because Tecolote Farm, and I'm looking at you right now. It makes me nervous talking about it right there. I hope I get it right. So Tecolote Farm, east of Austin, who many of you may know and love. And so you may be familiar with this story too, because it did get a lot of press, especially in Austin. Tecolote Farm had some big neighbors coming next door. Some subdivisions, the county, Travis County, with big pumps, and their well went dry. And this is an example of what the rule of capture ends up doing. There's no sense in taking that to court, because the court will just throw it out because of the rule of capture. The rule of capture lets that happen, and whether it's neighborly is another question. And there are other ways you can try to work it out, but going to court with a situation like that, when you're not in a district and there's no other regulation, is, there's no point in doing that. The TCEQ has nothing to do with it. So that's what can happen with groundwater. That's something to think about if, and again, if you're far away from all your neighbors and have a great groundwater source, hooray. But if, and I think this is relevant now with population growth, if golf courses and subdivisions are coming your way, and or even just a new neighbor who seems to be digging up some ornamental ponds that you know are going to use that pump until, be aware that that's the law, and you can be aware of it and then you can't really do much with it, but it's nice to be aware, I think. It's the first step. And so yeah, and get friendly with your neighbors. So because we can see what kind of result the rule of capture can have, over the years, now courts won't do anything about it, but over the years the legislature has devised a system of groundwater regulation through groundwater conservation districts. And those are local level regulatory bodies that have the authority to regulate pumping. They can require meters, meters on wells, they can require permits for wells, they can cap how much groundwater can be pumped and do that in various ways. And so they can alter the rule of capture in those ways. Now I say they can do all of those things. Not all districts do those things. There are almost 100 districts in the state. I think, or maybe there are over 100, but it's around 100. And if you looked at a map of Texas of all the districts, you'd see a patchwork of all these different colored districts and some white spots. And the white spots are areas of the state where there is no district, and that's where the rule of capture, the default rule, applies. And then in all the other districts, they all have their own rules. So they may incorporate various of those powers that I mentioned that they have. Some use them more than others. So some have always regulated quite a bit since their inception, that's why they came into being. Others have been around for decades and don't do much regulating yet. And I say yet, I've talked to farmers who are concerned that with population growth, with drought, that maybe their district will start regulating soon, and what could that end up meaning for a farmer who relies heavily on groundwater and, you know, as part of their business model to grow their crops, and what does it mean if regulation comes in, what will it cost? And so different districts, like I said, they regulate differently, and most of them, I believe, have their rules on their websites. So if you're in a district that has regulated a lot, you probably know that. If you've metered your well, if you have a permit, then you know probably what's going on with your district. But if you're in a district that hasn't regulated much, it's possible that you don't know much of what's going on with your district. I think most districts have some version of an elected board, but again, that can vary because there are so many and they have different structures. So that's something to check the rules about, and also start asking around town. Find out who the general manager is, find out who the board members are, start asking questions and seeing whether regulation is coming, see what you can do to go to public meetings if they're held, and sorry, I lost my train of thought. But and rules can change too, and so that's another thing to be aware of as a landowner in a groundwater conservation district. Again, this is something you might know of if it's going on. I can think of districts that I know of where power on the board has shifted back and forth over the years. There are different factions within the county who have different ideas about how groundwater should be regulated, and the board starts out being made up of one group, and then election time comes and the power changes and the rules change and the lawsuit gets settled. And then election time comes again and the power changes again and the rules change again. So as a landowner, to have rules change, of course, is perhaps a stressful thing, but maybe that depends on what side of the board you're on. So I'll wrap up. Hopefully that overview, surface water, the rural capture and groundwater conservation districts, at least gives you a place to start if you're interested in learning more. And with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to Cypress.